Welcome to Tarantula Collective. My name is Richard, and today we're going to count down the top 5 first pet tarantulas. Anytime someone sends me a message and asks me what they should get as their first pet tarantula, I almost always recommend one of these 5 species. They're very hardy, very easy to take care of, they're forgiving of beginner mistakes, they don't have medically significant venom, they are generally very friendly tarantulas, they're easy to handle, and they're just beautiful, readily available, and just great tarantulas for really anyone out there. But specifically for those getting their first tarantulas or just very new to the hobby. But even if you keep a lot of tarantulas and you don't have any of these 5 species, then I highly suggest you get one because they are amazing. So we're going to start off with number 5, the Brachypelma auratum, more commonly known as the Mexican flame knee tarantula. This species is a New World terrestrial tarantula from central Mexico, around the Balsas dry forest on the inland side of the Sierra Madre del Sur. The most popular species in this genus is probably the Brachypelma humori, used to be known as the Brachypelma smithi, or the Mexican red-knee tarantula. Pretty much any pet store you go to, or anytime you see a photo or some video of a tarantula, this is a species you're gonna see. But in my opinion, the Brachypelma auratum is a much better species. They have an amazing contrast between the bright reds on their knees and the velvety black hair, as well as having a very bold personality. My auratums are almost always out on display. They also start showing their adult patterns and colors pretty early in life. Usually by the time they're a juvenile, they look almost like their adult counterparts. Their care is very simple. They're a hardy species, so even if you make mistakes early on, it's usually not going to cause any problems. And their temperament will vary between specimens and even in between molts of the same specimen. But generally speaking, in my experience, the Brachypelma auratum is the more chill of all of the Brachypelma species. Most of mine do have bald spots on their abdomen where they've kicked off hair, but I've never actually seen them kick the hair at me directly, which leads us to the downsides of this species. They do have urticating setae, and the type that they have can be very irritating to humans. The auratum can also be a bit of a pet rock. Like, it's always out on display. I rarely ever find mine in their burrow, but that's about it. They're usually just standing there, not really moving around a lot. And even though they are readily available in most cases, because they're not as common or as popular as the humori, sometimes a Mexican flame knee tarantula can cost a little bit more than other species in their genus. So let's move on to number 4, the Grammostola pulchra, or the Brazilian black tarantula. This New World tarantula is found mainly in the grasslands of Brazil, but there are also closely related species that look identical to the Brazilian black that may actually be from just across the river from their native location and can be found in Uruguay and Argentina. Now, this is a classic looking tarantula. It's very gorgeous, it's got a very velvety black color, and just looks super soft. They have a very gentle demeanor, and in most cases, they're a great species of tarantula to handle if you're into that kind of thing. Many people describe them as the black Labrador of the tarantula hobby. Because they're such a great beginner species, it's so beautiful and iconic. Typically, captive bred specimens are very easy to find, and they're not that expensive. So they're a great all-around tarantula species. But there are a few drawbacks. Depending on the supply and demand, sometimes the price of spiderlings can get a little high. And if you're looking for an adult female or even a confirmed juvenile female, they might be a lot more expensive than other tarantula species that are similar in size. They can also be very slow growing, so if you get a tiny spiderling, it's going to take years before it really starts getting that adult look to it. But that goes hand in hand with a long-lived species. They also may not be great for you if you're looking for a tarantula that's extremely colorful. If you're looking for beautiful patterns and pops of bright color, this definitely is not the species for you. They have a deep, velvety black color that I really like and a lot of people prefer, but it's definitely not a species for everyone. The Brazilian black tarantula will actually be one of 2 species that I will be featuring in the next drop from my Tarantula Origin Series line of coffees. It'll be a dark roast single origin coffee that comes from Brazil. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. I'll be announcing that launch later on this month. But I did just get in a freshly roasted batch of the Zebra Knee coffee, which I launched back before Christmas. And for the first 20 orders for the Zebra Knee coffee that come in after I release this video, I will include one of these Tarantula Collective acrylic pens at no charge. My gift to you a way of saying thanks. These are not for sale anywhere. You can't buy them. The only way to get them is to be one of the first 20 people to order a bag of coffee once this video drops. I will leave a link to my website where you can pick up that coffee down below in the description, as well as in the pinned comment. Now let's move on to number 3, the Aphonopelma chalcodes. This is probably one of the most famous New World tarantulas, especially in the US, rivaled only by the Aphonopelma hensey or the Texas brown tarantula. This famous terrestrial species is found in the arid scrublands of Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. They have a very gentle demeanor and a beautiful appearance, and as an adult, they are almost always on display. They are one of the few tarantulas that are actually native to the United States. They're easy to care for. They're a very hardy species. And they're great for beginners because they're very forgiving of any mistakes you may make. Similar to the last species, this tarantula is usually referred to as the golden retriever of the tarantula hobby. And even though they are an Aphonopelma species, which takes a long time to breed, there are a lot of people here in the States that are breeding them in captivity. So they're usually pretty easy to find and they're not too expensive. I think I've got almost all my Aphonopelma species from Nate at Micro Wilderness, and I will put a link as well as a discount code down below in the description. But it is not all good news. This species does have some drawbacks. The biggest one is that they are very slow growing. If you get a spiderling, it is going to be years, like 5 to 10 years before they're really looking like an adult, especially if they're female. And because they do grow so slowly, it is typical for most people to overfeed them. So you really don't want to go off any kind of care sheet that says this amount of food this often. You really want to gauge how you feed them based on their abdomen size. If it starts getting bigger or wider than the carapace, then you can skip feeding them for a little while. They also spend a whole lot of time in their burrow when they're young. So if you get a spiderling or even a small juvenile, very rarely are you going to see them. But that's okay because there's not really much to look at. When they're that young, they're very bland. They're kind of this tannish, grayish color. There's really not much hair. There's no pattern or anything like that. They just look like a basic, boring spiderling. And the final drawback is that even as adults, when they go into pre-molt, they can go into their burrow and hide out there for months at a time. Once they're getting close to their adult size, they do typically stay out in the open a lot. But again, anytime they go into pre-molt, they're most likely going to hide away in that burrow and you're just not going to see them and you don't want to disturb them. And number 2 is going to be the Chilacotelma albopilosus, or the curly-haired tarantula. This New World species is found in the tropical scrublands of Central America, around Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. They have a very unique appearance, the longest setae of any tarantula out there, giving them this wiry but fluffy, almost a Brillo pad kind of appearance. In most cases, they have a very gentle demeanor and are a great species to handle, again, if you're into that kind of thing. And any curly hair that I've ever had has always been kind of slow to kick hairs. I really have to irritate them and annoy them before they start kicking those hairs up in defense. Being one of the longest established species in the tarantula hobby and how easy they are to breed, they are widely available almost anywhere in the world and they are usually very cheap. In fact, a lot of times you can get a curly hair tarantula as a freebie when you're buying a bunch of other tarantulas from an online dealer. And they're not a tarantula that's going to bolt a whole lot. Most of the time they're moving, it's very slow and deliberate, but they do have a great feeding response. So once you drop some prey in there, they will bolt for short distances just to attack that prey. Now the downside is they do have those urticarian hairs. Before they were moved to the Chilacotelma genus, they were in the Brachypelma genus, and Brachypelmas are known for having some pretty irritating hairs. But like I said earlier, mine are not prone to kick them at me, but that doesn't mean they never kick them. Almost every curly hair tarantula I've had has always had a bald spot on its abdomen, because they like to kick those hairs on and around their burrow as a line of defense. So even though they may not kick the hairs at you, if you put your hand in their enclosure to move some stuff around, you gotta be careful, maybe wear some gloves so you don't get those hairs in between your fingers. And just like the last tarantula, even though they are out on display a lot as adults, when they go into pre-molt or when they are young, they typically will spend most of their time in their burrow. But once they kind of hit that juvenile stage, when they really start showing those long hairs and beautiful colors, they spend a lot more time out in the open. And the only other downside to them is that they're a bit of a pet rock. I've got a few behind me right now that are probably standing in the same position they were in 2 days ago. If there's not a lot going on, if there's not prey to capture, or you're not moving their enclosure, they will just kind of shut down like your computer. They'll just go to sleep and they'll just stay there until something kind of wakes them up. There's some kind of stimulus input. So they're on display, but they're not really doing anything. So the number 1, the best first pet tarantula, one of the easiest species out there, as well as one of the friendliest species in my opinion, is the Grammostola pulchripes, or the Chaco golden knee tarantula. Hailing from the Gran Chaco, this tarantula is found in the grasslands of Argentina and Paraguay. They're possibly one of the chillest tarantulas out there. Almost every time I go to a reptile expo, I'll see somebody behind a booth handling a Chaco golden knee tarantula. They're known for being laid back, and it's usually the go-to species for most people that like to handle tarantulas. And I've got a whole video on the do's and don'ts when it comes to handling tarantulas that I will link above. And this is another species that is very hardy and relatively long-lived, as well as being very forgiving of any mistakes you may make with their husbandry early on. I mean, they're not bulletproof, but they're not going to immediately die if the moisture level is off in their enclosure. They've got beautiful bright gold bands on their legs that really make them stand out, especially right after a molt. It is gorgeous. When someone comes to the collective and wants to hold a tarantula, this is the species I usually go to. I've got a few of them, and all of them act very similar. They're very chill. They'll usually walk right onto the hand and slowly will pace around or just stay still. And because they're so beautiful, most people are a little less likely to be kind of freaked out by them. And because they are a Grammostola species, they do have the least urticating hairs of all the New World tarantulas out there who have urticating setae. So even if they do kick some hair on you, it's barely noticeable. I don't remember the last time I felt itchy after handling a Grammostola or moving around their enclosure, especially with the pulchripes. And because they are such a popular tarantula, especially for beginners, they're widely available, they're usually very cheap, easy to come by, and is highly recommended from many people across the hobby. That being said, there are a few drawbacks. One being that they're not as long-lived as all the other tarantulas on this list. While most of the females of the species on this list will live up to about 20-25 years, female Grammostola pulchripes maybe only live about 15 years in captivity, while males are only going to live maybe about 5 or 6 years. Another drawback is they're pretty boring as spiderlings. They're very drab colors that don't really have a pattern at all, very similar to some of the Aphonopelma species, and they're going to be in their burrow like 90% of the time. You may only ever see them when they come out to get a drink or to capture some prey. And like many of the other species on this list, they can go on hunger strike, where they don't eat for weeks or even months at a time. And as a new keeper, that can always be a little distressing, even though it's completely normal behavior. If there's a tarantula out there that you think makes a great first species for a new keeper that didn't make this list, be sure to tell me about it down below in the comments. I also have a mini nature documentary for every species on this list I will link down below in the description. As always, I appreciate you watching. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for buying Tarantula Collective coffee, and I will see you next Tuesday.